Hello, I'm Claire Reinders. I study at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. I was studying abroad on a May term in Northern Ireland and Scotland, doing research and conducting interviews for my Peace and Reconciliation class. I interviewed people from all over the world about their personal stories. As a disclaimer, I wanted to start out by telling you I lost these precious videos and photos when my phone sank to the bottom of Lake Michigan. Don't get me wrong, I'm extremely sad about this, but I would still love to share these incredible people's stories and all the wisdom they shared with me. Although it will not be the same as hearing it from their own perspectives and voices, I will do my best to tell you about their lives in relation to my topic. Speaking of my topic, let me share my research question with you. My question is, how does violence versus nonviolence resistance impact people personally and society as a whole? Has nonviolence resistance or violent actions been more successful to create change in Northern Ireland and Scotland? Would they be where they were today in terms of peace without the use of violence? I've focused specifically on each person's experience with violence in their lives or in their community. I interviewed many people who had participated in nonviolent campaigns and protests throughout their lives. I asked questions about whether they thought violence or nonviolence was more effective in creating change, if violence can ever be justified, and if their religious beliefs had anything to do with their views. As we have all seen in the news lately, the world has an immense problem with a lack of peace and a lack of reconciliation. Violence often seems to be the reactor and the reaction. There have been bombings at concerts like Manchester or the Boston Marathon. These tragedies make people scared to leave their homes. There are shootings at schools that make the safest places seem unsafe. The shocking part about this is that violence is not the best way to create change, but it seems to be the most prominent. There is research that proves that more than 1/4 of nonviolent campaigns succeed. Campaigns of nonviolence can be more effective than violence in achieving their stated goal, because it gets much more support from citizens. There is a higher level of participation because it is less commitment and more resilient. As I talked with many people, I realized that they had similar opinions about violence. This is where I found my thesis that violence is not and should never be the answer. Some countries and people turn to violence because they do not know of anything better, but nonviolence is the ideal form to creating change and bringing true peace and reconciliation to a country or a person individually. Nonviolence is what all my interviewees believe creates the most change when it comes to dealing with conflict. Sadly, the world is not perfect, and violence often happens anyways, even if the movement started out nonviolent. The world obviously has a long way to go before nonviolence resistance will be the first and only movement towards peace and reconciliation. But it gives me hope talking to so many others who believe it is the answer. And now I will share parts of their stories with you. I would like to start off by sharing the interview with a woman named Elizabeth. She was a volunteer worker at the Abbey on Iona.
Make a protest, and that's what we did, and not just once but several times. And we got arrested. I had 3 cautions for breach of the peace, and each time they called them what we used to call them the Black Mariahs. They were big black vans, and they brought for people who were lying in the street or whatever, which is what we did at one point. We just sort of sat down in the middle of the road with our prams and stopped the traffic, and all that, and bundled us in the vans and took us down to the police station, and then called our husbands to come and collect us, and gave us cautions in front of our husbands, and bound us over to keep peace. And did that quite a lot with him. And so I was arrested 3 times, and after that my husband said it might affect his career if which it could well have done at that point, because it's different these days, but then I went on to work in sort of, I suppose, helping to make life better for people who were on the edge, poor people and people who were not in very good circumstances. I trained and became a social worker, particularly because of that. And then I'm still involved in protests, but more to do with Tibet. I've been involved with the Tibetan Society and with what's happening in Tibet since 1973, which is when the Chinese first...
As you hear from Elizabeth's story, she's participated in nonviolence resistance for her whole life. She took part in many protests for civil rights, women's rights, and fighting for peace against nuclear plants. She went to jail 3 times and her husband would pick her up. When I asked if her husband would be mad, Elizabeth told me, "No, my husband supported me because he knew that it was the right thing." She said that sometimes the protests would turn violent when the police force brought in water guns and other weapons. She believed that this violence was unnecessary and cruel, considering they were a nonviolent resistance protest. Elizabeth is still to this day involved in protests against nuclear warfare and for the Tibetan Society. Elizabeth firmly believes that all conflicts can be solved through nonviolence. Next, you will hear Adam from South Africa speak. He was a volunteer at the Abbey in Iona. Like Elizabeth, he believes that nonviolence resistance is the best way to create change. He has personally participated in many protests in South Africa for problems like the high costs of the university. He has seen many of these peaceful protests turn violent, but also seen them work towards a greater good for the peace of the community.
This reading a few weeks ago, and it immediately made me think of home, South Africa. My country, like many others, has a long history of protest action, some of them large and others small. Some of the protests may have seemed futile at the time, but ultimately have had an immeasurable impact on South Africa. 40 years since the Soweto uprising of 1976. Students took to the streets once more to protest the high university fees and an academic syllabus considered too Eurocentric for a country that is desperately trying to rearrange its social structures. These student protests also ended in violence. It may feel as though I have painted a gloomy picture of South Africa and of protest action in general. But I do not think this is the case. As much as protests symbolize defiance and a refusal to accept the status quo, they are also expressions of hope for a better future. I believe that one of the messages of the Iona community is hope. Hope for justice and peace. And so I say, let us protest where and when the need arises. And let us protest with hope. Just as the protest actions of the women and students in South Africa went on to change the nation's history, so our voices, raised together in protest against what is wrong in our communities, have the chance of shaping our world to be a better place for all peoples.
I have another amazing story I would like to share about a woman who houses asylum seekers. Her name is Sally Beaumont. She started preaching nonviolence when she was a teacher and wouldn't hit the kids with her belt. Instead, she would kiss and hug them, because doing violence teaches violence. Violence is not justified. She has been in several nonviolent protests and arrested for it. She can't even leave the UK because of being arrested so many times. But this is what Sally says about the protests. When they tell me to leave, I sit. When they tell me to leave again, I lay down. When they use force, I start singing.
Stephen McConnelly was 14 or 11 years of age, standing here when an armoured car pulled up on the edge of the chair. Back door of the armoured car opened. A soldier opened the front and fired on Stephen McConnelly with a plastic bullet. I don't know if you've seen a plastic bullet or a rubber bullet yet. When you get to Belfast, I think somebody may very well have one. But just to explain it to you, plastic bullet about 4.5 inches long. It's 1.5 inches in diameter. It's made of solid neoprene. There's no flexibility in it. And it leaves the muzzle of the weapon at 200 miles an hour. And at a range of 15 feet, that's what hit Stephen McConnell on the back of the head. Pulverized the skull and he died a day and a half later in hospital. These were supposed to be used as the primary method of non-lethal riot control. From they were developed, and right through to 1998, I think 19 people have been killed, and over half of those have been children under 14 years of age. Most of them have been hit on the head. And that's not counting the numerous injuries, people who've lost eyes, who've been damaged, brain damage as a result of being hit in the head with these plastic bullets.
John McCourt was a former IRA member and Bloody Sunday survivor. He spoke to us about the heartbreaking and terrifying time when he witnessed his friends get murdered in front of him during Bloody Sunday. I asked him if he thought violence was necessary or justified in this scenario, and he replied that he used to believe that you can't meet violence with nonviolence. But after seeing his friend murdered in front of him and all the other people who were killed during the Troubles, he now believes that not even violence can justify using violence in return.
Where we acknowledge that all of us acknowledge the communal suffering on this whole city as a result of that, and find ways of moving forward together with it. Not pretending it didn't happen, not closing it up in a box and forgetting about it, because nobody's going to forget about it. You're never going to go through a Christmas day with an empty chair at a table and not realise that your brother should be there, or your father should be there, or your daughter should be there. That's going to be there as long as you love, and your children are going to get the same thing. So what we need to do is break that cycle and insist that this is about vengeance and not about justice.
Building, it came down like that and it killed 9 innocent people, and most of them were women and children. It was a very, very bleak and bad time. Why? What made it so particularly bad? Just over there, not too far from where we signed the wall, is a place called Clonard Monastery. And the IRA Sinn Féin leader, Gerry Adams, was in secret talks with a man called John Hume. John Hume was at that stage the leader of the largest nationalist party in Northern Ireland, the SDLP, Social Democratic Labour Party. He won the Nobel Peace Prize years later with Trimble. Bono of U2 presented them with the Nobel Peace Prize. And John Hume was trying to convince Gerry Adams to bring the IRA away from armed struggle and say a ceasefire. But when this young man died, this IRA bomber died, Gerry Adams carried his coffin in a full paramilitary funeral with the trickler and the burying gloves, and shots fired over the coffin, masked gunmen. And the people with Shankill said, he can talk peace by day, he's conspiring with murderers at night. The UDA retaliated for that attack, or that atrocity, with one of their own. They bounced into a bar in Greystone in County Londonderry, armed with automatic weapons. They opened fire, wearing Halloween masks, and they killed 7 people, 7 Catholics. And that became known as the trick-or-treat killings because they wore the Halloween mask. But look at the date again, 23rd of October 93. Less than a year after those atrocities, all the paramilitaries, Republican and Loyalist, have announced ceasefires. 31st of August 94, the Provisional IRA. 13th of October 94, the Combined Loyalist Military Command. So even though that was a very bad and bleak time, it didn't derail the peace process. And from then until now, even though their ceasefires all broke down, from then till now, Loyalists and Republican paramilitaries have not attacked each other. So
I think that if your father was a political prisoner in the 1940s, then at some point you're going to be a political prisoner in the 1960s.
Yeah.
And your children are going to be political prisoners in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And again, as part of that is maintaining the cycle. Because we haven't found a way to break out. We haven't found the conversation or the language that allows us to think outside of that box that says maybe there's another way. Is it possible to be a Republican in today's world and not espouse the use of violence to achieve your ends? I believe it is. I think we proved that it is. And
and I think this is where that change happens.
As you can tell from the stories of these brave people, nonviolence resistance is the way to create true change, and violence will never do any good for anyone. I'm not saying that it will be easy, and I'm not saying that it will happen anytime soon. But if people and countries ever want to have real change, heartfelt peace, and honest reconciliation, then they need to walk away from the idea that violence will get them to this point. Violence will never be the answer for change. The world should work on nonviolence resistance to create peace.